Kalina is a psychotherapist and she holds a PhD in psychoanalysis and anthropology from UCL from UK. She has been researching transmission of traumatic experience across generations in the families of war survivors from Bosnia and Herzegovina. She's currently working with Assistance Center for Torture Survivors in Bulgaria. And now, Kalina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to make sure that everybody's with me and everybody hears me well. Can you please just confirm that?
Yeah, I can hear you very well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for introducing me, and just one detail. I also work for the Child Hub, which is now hosting this event. Within the next 1 hour, my colleagues and I will be talking about the transmission of experience across generations. And we will be also sharing good practices from mainly Bosnia about how intergenerational communication can help people make sense of history. I would first outline briefly the structure of my presentation, which will last for about 20-25 minutes. I will be talking about how children of war survivors understand the past of their parents, and whether possible for parents to discuss this directly with their children, and if not, why is this not possible. I will outline the key concepts of memory and memory transmission first, and then I will give one case study, one example from my clinical practice as a psychotherapist, which I believe will connect the theoretical presentation to practice and in particular to the field of child protection, which is the main focus of this webinar and the platform as a whole. And this case study, I believe, will also give a good illustration of how parents and children are connected and how important it is for us to work with the child, but also with the child's environment and the whole family, which is also one of the focuses of the deinstitutionalization process which is taking place in Bulgaria for years now. So let me first outline the concept of transmission the way I understand it and its relevance to child protection. I will kick off by saying that we all have memories of the past, and we use memory in order to organize our past and to achieve continuity of experience and time, which means that we use memory in order to maintain our identity, which is to say the sense of knowing who we are, and where we come from. However, we construct our identity not only on the basis of what we have first-hand experienced, but also on the basis of what we hear, what we see, and what we learn from the previous generations, which basically makes us a descendant of a particular family in a particular culture. And this is what I call the transmission of experience. So the transmission of experience, or the transmission of memory from one generation to another, is also shaped by war and violence. And today, in the midst of the Syrian civil war, for example, we see how violence uproots millions of people from their domestic milieu and embeds them in the new environment. So I will only refer to UNICEF and say that 2 million Syrian children have been forced to flee their country, and another 4 million are displaced within Syria. So this is where I find the relevance, the connection between the more theoretical part I will be talking about and the more pressing present-day issues regarding child protection. Many children are born and will be born in exile, and this pushes us towards having a more informed way of handling humanitarian crisis, and more precisely, providing appropriate services to children. which are the result of such, or find themselves in the midst of such humanitarian crisis. So I will be talking briefly about three main questions. The first one, and I will then move to my first slide, is how is the traumatic experience transmitted from parents to children? In order to illustrate this, I will give one example from my fieldwork from Bosnia from 2012, where almost 20 years after the end of the Bosnian War today, the war is still present in the everyday life of people, meaning that they live in still next to half-ruined buildings. They joke about the wartime living conditions, commemorate the dead, make war-related films, and so on and so forth. And during one of my research visits to a Bosnian family with whom I have agreed to have an interview, the mother with whom I was about to chat was preparing the coffee for us in the kitchen, while the kids were watching TV in the other room, when suddenly she overheard the lines of the movie which had just started. And it turned out that it was The Pianist by Roman Polanski, telling the story of the Nazi invasion of the Jewish quarter of Warsaw. So silently, but quite quickly, the woman unplugged the TV directly from the socket with no explanation to her children. They remained rather puzzled, but did not ask any questions. In reality, the woman, and this is something which came out during our interview, the woman in this family had been held war prisoner during the war of 1992-1995, and this was her way of handling the war memories once they basically intruded after she heard the first lines of the film. So I gave this example to illustrate that very often children are the first recipients of the traumatic memories of their parents. But more importantly, to actually highlight that the transmission of memory doesn't take place through a consistent narrative, but quite the contrary. It takes place through sudden and very often surprising acts, bodily symptoms, jokes, object, pieces of the landscape, or photographs, pieces of clothing and furniture that link back to the war. But the parents are rather reluctant or unable to create a consistent story about the war. And I'm going to show you my next slide, which explores my second question, and it is, why are children receptive then to the traumatic content which very often parents are trying to withhold from them? Drawing on my experience with war victims, but also on the previous studies, primarily after the Holocaust, I argue that children actively seek information. They're not the passive end, they're not the passive recipients of information, but they're very active in seeking information about their family's past in order to acquire the sense of belonging to a particular family through knowing. In other words, this is how they locate themselves in a particular culture, in a particular family, and acquire the sense of belonging to it. Second, and also a very important part of this active pursuit of knowledge about the family's past, is the attempt of children to emotionally connect to their parents by seconding their feelings regarding the war. And I'm going to give one example from an interview I had with a 15-year-old Bosnian girl who told me, I'm quoting, "I often post war-related songs on the Facebook wall of my dad, and when I see him crying, I also cry." Basically, what she was saying to me was that she was using the war experience as a bridge between her generation and the generation of the father in order to better understand his experiences. So the final question I would like to explore in this rather more theoretical part is what makes the war generation, and this is the next slide I'm going to show you, reluctant to discuss the war experiences with their children. Why is it so difficult for the war survivor to create a coherent war narrative? And this is where my presentation connects to the next speaker, Aida Ganovic, who's going to talk about whether appropriate at all and at what developmental stage of the child it may be appropriate to discuss this topic directly. However, what I encountered during my research were 5 major reasons for the parents' difficulty to start a question openly, a question about the war with their children in the first person singular. And first and foremost, I believe that it's a natural desire to protect the child from the traumatic. However, I argue from my position of a psychologist that very often this is due to the parents' own anxieties related to the topic of the war, rather than to the children's inability to make sense of history. The second reason for the difficulty of survivors to create a narrative about the war is their feeling that the war started in a very overwhelming, sudden, and somewhat surreal or unreal way, because many of them denied the warning signs of the approaching war. And this is what is taking place pretty much in Syria at the moment, when people leave, when they have no other choice. So later on, this makes it very difficult to describe to someone without such experience what it was like to live under war circumstances. The third reason I would like to tackle is the experience of extreme violence, which prevents people from being able to remember. There are certain parts of history which remain blank spots in memory. Fourth, I would suggest that there is ambiguity of parents' experiences of war, and this means that sometimes recalling the experience of the war may touch upon very painful and inconvenient memories, which do not fall within the main or the public discourse of the war. And this is why parents may prefer not to confront what officially is considered history. And the final reason I came across, particularly in Bosnia, but I also believe in very other other places all over the world. I can now think of one research made by anthropologist Vinod Das in India, immediately after the partition of India and Pakistan, when she's coming to this same difficulty of people to tackle certain inconvenient memories, because there is a clear-cut political narrative which doesn't allow inconvenient narratives to emerge. This very much relates to the wider context rather than to the intimate environment of the family. So, quickly drawing the conclusions before sharing the case study with you, I want to say that children reconstruct the war past of their family in order to place themselves in history and relationship, to feel that they belong to a certain family. But this happens in the absence of a coherent war narrative, but rather in the everyday interaction with their parents, when they're faced with partial experiences, fragmented memories, objects, and acts of speech. So, by learning about the war mainly from non-verbal interaction, children grasp many parallel discourses and ambivalent attitudes. In order to connect now this to my work with war survivors and children of war survivors, I will briefly outline one example of a man in his early 40s who came to see me as a psychologist a couple of months ago, together with his 9-year-old son. The father came from Syria immediately after his home was destroyed by bombing. And he came to see me because his son started sleepwalking. The boy was also screaming during the night. The father experienced him as very nervous and anxious and so on and so forth. So he brought the boy to a psychological consultation. However, during the first conversation with the boy, he told me that he couldn't remember anything from the war. He tended to respond with no, and I don't know anything, even before I asked the question. So he left me with a rather bizarre kind of experience of someone who had something to share, but he didn't want to. However, the father requested to talk to me in person immediately after this initial conversation. And during the conversation with him alone, it turned out that the father had witnessed the violent death of his own father, as well as the bombing of the marketplace of his hometown, in which dozens of people were killed, and he had to bury some of the bodies, so he basically handled the corpses. And during the family's stay in Turkey for some 20 days on their way from Syria to Bulgaria, the father couldn't sleep, his hair grew grey for about 1 week, and he had the feeling that death was constantly after him. So the father couldn't bear with the very topic of the war, and he preferred to stay alone. I accepted to work with the son, and I started opening, within the next couple of sessions, I started opening the topic of the war gradually in order to allow the child to have a safe space to talk about what was forbidden to be discussed at home. And gradually he remembered his house, he remembered his school friends, his favorite toys. He talked about his grandfather who was killed. So the boy told me that the father grew very nervous after the family left Syria, and it was him who needed help. The boy felt sorry for the father, and he didn't want to disturb him with questions about the war. So what the boy basically did was that he tried to protect his father by not talking about the war at all, by developing a symptom. A month later, that was in August this year, the boy's symptom disappeared. Now he's still having some difficulties falling asleep, but there is no sleepwalking and screaming during the night. Now it's interesting to highlight that after the sleepwalking of the boy disappeared, the father came to see me, and he shared that he was indeed the one who needed help, and he requested psychological consultation. So by giving this example, I want to point out 3 main things. The first one, that there is a very strong unconscious link between parents and children. And while working with the child, and this very much refers also to children in alternative care, we have to work with their parents and the wider environment. Second, it is of essential importance for child protection professionals to acknowledge the early identification and intervention, because this is of utmost importance. The earlier we intervene, the better. And finally, I just want to summarize the kind of analytically what I think that happened in this family with the boy and the father I discussed a minute ago. Very often, children identify with their parents, and they may develop a symptom instead of them. So once the child gets better, the parent may get worse. And this again leads to the first point I make. It's of utmost importance to work with both children and their environments. And I thank you for your attention, and I hand over to Aida Ganovic. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalina, very much. That was very interesting. I will give the floor to Aida in a minute. Just let me change the slide. And let me introduce Ida quickly. She's a counselor and psychotherapist from Reality Therapy. She's trained in philosophy and methods of psychodrama, and for 10 years she has been working in psychosocial counseling center with clients who had war caused consequences in their daily life, both children and adults. And at the moment she's working in the SOS Children International in the Bosnia and Herzegovina. Ida, the floor is yours. Thank you. Hello, Ida. Can you hear us? Ida, can you please make sure your microphone and the speakers are green? Ida, can you try and speak now? Okay, while we are solving the issue with Ida, it might make sense to give the floor to Maya, our third speaker. Maya, can we please check?
Do you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Oh, great.
So, Maya, that's a huge echo. So I will give the floor to Maya now, and we will try and resolve the issue with Ida. Sorry about that. So Maida is a counselor and a cognitive behavioral therapy practitioner, and she's currently working in the non-profit organization in Bosnia, which is called Foundation Wings of Hope, whose primary goal is child empowerment, and she provides psychosocial counseling for children and young people with behavioral and emotional difficulties. Maya, please, you can start now.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to say hello to everyone and to thank Eugenia for the introduction. My role today is to try to connect theory that you have just heard on transgression of trauma with an example of how incorporating these findings in strategies of reconciliation processes in Bosnia can be beneficial for its long-term success. First of all, I would like to start by saying something about Bosnia context. Bosnia is a very complex, multifaceted society that has for centuries been an arena for many violent conflicts. Those that were especially devastating, and I don't mean necessarily by economic standards, were of course conflicts amongst ethnic groups that live here. During centuries, there has been certain kind of repetition of these conflicts. So there is a saying here in Bosnia that we have war every 50 years or so. On that note, I believe the two examples of transgenerational transmission would be beneficial for understanding its mechanisms in this particular context and place. First one is an example of two Serb generals who were convicted for some horrific war crimes in this war, and who themselves were coming from families that were victims of similar atrocities during the Second World War. A second example is a bit more general and a bit more closely related to Vulcan's idea of transgenerational transmission of so-called chosen trauma, by which I mean shared event in relation to which group feels helpless, victimized, and humiliated by other groups, in the extent that it carries the image of the event along with associated shared feelings of hurt, shame from generation to generation. Such an event has a great influence on people's feelings toward their own and enemy group, and can be used as a trigger to provoke certain reactions and behaviors that are retaliatory in its function. In this context, I believe that image of possible battle has had a similar impact on people that live here. Even now, more than 600 years after this event, you can almost hear regularly reminders or references on that battle in general discourse of politicians and ordinary people. So I believe that this event has been transmitted through generation, almost like on archetype level, as a symbol of great courage of one nation against overwhelming odds, but as well it is often used as a reason for justification of engaging in conflict in these parts. So what I was trying to say is, on one hand, transgenerational transmission takes place on an individual but collective manner as well, and secondly, it occurs in a spontaneous way, but as well in a planned manner as a means for gaining control. But one way or another, I believe that the introduction of transgenerational transmission is very useful for illuminating some more hidden aspects of these ethnic conflicts, as well as the reasons why, at least on some visible level, they seem to come so easily provoked. In analyzing mechanisms in which transmission takes place, two processes come up as important. First one is one that Karina already mentioned, and that is developing a healthy method of communication in families, which can range from total silence about the negative events on one hand, to their imposing of their own interpretations of those events on family members or children. But in both cases, children are not provided with the full details about what had really happened to their parents, and are left replaying their worst imaginations over and over again. Second important aspect is, of course, social context of this process, namely in relation to these kinds of traumatic events. Families often experience big changes in the way they are functioning on an everyday basis, their routines, financial situations, loss of former friendship and social networks. So what I'm trying to say is that psychological trauma shouldn't be seen as just a psychological result of one specific event, but rather as a combination of traumatic event and those reactions of a society. This is important because it goes against the idea that trauma is individual problem, which often can lead to an isolation of the traumatized individual, and transfers the responsibility for overcoming these experiences from individual to society. So important conclusions are that trauma often provokes isolation, which makes it more difficult to overcome, and that individuals who know more about their family ancestry or past shared events are better able to manage the effects of that traumatic stress. Some of these findings we have tried to implement in a project that we are currently working on, which is a part of Dialogue for the Future Reconciliation Initiative of UN agencies and Presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Our project name is Children of Water, Children of Peace, and I believe it is a unique project that came up as a result of collaboration of organizations working with ex-juvenile participants of the war and Foundation Wings of Hope that really tries to do enormous job on promotion and protection of human rights and mental health. The main idea of the project is that ex-juvenile participants of the war try to present their experiences from the periods before, during and after the war to adolescents from 14 to 17 years old as a means of promoting an idea that armed conflict is never a good solution, that it never brings you closer to your goals, and that it's never an answer to any problem. In relation to everything that has just been said, our main activity was, of course, open dialogue between children and educators through discourse of sharing personal human experiences. As we have already said, gaps in knowledge of what had really happened regarding those past events is often an important factor for later development of trauma symptoms in second generation, children of traumatized parents. So answering painful questions instead of avoiding them meant a great deal to the children because, as many of them said, this was the first time they had opportunity to hear stories from all sides, which helped them to get a clearer image of what was really happening during that time. Secondly, this kind of personal sharing has had an additional rehumanizing effect for children in terms that they had felt that before of this experience, they had imagined members of conflicted armies always as monsters or non-humans, labeling them with crossed abusive names. So this opportunity to talk to them directly helped them to level down some of those ideas and to understand more clearly that human aspect of the war. Everything that was said was followed with group discussions as well as structured lectures about theory on transgenerational transmission of trauma, prejudices, stereotypes, ethnic identity, and mechanisms for nonviolent conflict resolution. And in general, our feedback was that children found introduction of concept of transgenerational transmission very useful because, on one hand, it helped them to better understand mechanisms through which this transgenerational transmission takes place here, as well as the ways in which it contributes to acquisition of some potentially risky stereotype attitudes and beliefs about other ethnic groups. Our next step is engaging more students in this discourse through organizing public lectures on the subject, and we are very optimistic, but we also believe if we want this idea to broaden in our society, more structured and organized intervention is needed, mainly through education, and secondly through creating more space for an open dialogue and exchange of experiences between different ethnic groups. That is always the best way for gaining lost trust. Thank you for your attention. That will be all.
Thank you very much. Let us make one more attempt to get connected to Ida. Hopefully it will work now. Ida, can you hear us? Hello. I cannot hear Ida, unfortunately. Let us take one more minute, and if we don't succeed, we will need to... Yes, I can see Ida can hear us, but we cannot hear you, Ida. Can you make sure your microphone and speakers are green? Ada, the last option I can suggest, you log out and log in again. And then if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. Okay, let us wait for 1 minute for Aida to join again. We are sorry about these technical difficulties. We did rehearse several times to make sure it will all work fine, but it happens, you know. Meanwhile, I would ask you to make your suggestions for future topics for webinars. If you could please draft any ideas you might have, any webinars that you might be interested. You don't need to write nicely formulated topics, but just any draft ideas. We would really be grateful to you. Thank you. You should be able to see the poll on the screen now. Aida, when you are here, please speak to us. Okay, unfortunately, we cannot figure out why we cannot hear either. That's really pity. Please feel free to ask your questions to the presenters. You can use Q&A section for that, and we will redirect questions to the speakers. We will all stay here for a while, so we will answer your questions if you have any. Thank you. And thank you very much, by the way, for providing ideas for the webinars. It's really, really helpful. Okay, we have a question from Daniel. How could we stimulate some war survivors to talk about their trauma with their families? Kalina, Maya, would you like to take this question? Kalina and Maya, you both have so please feel free to speak. Yes, Kalina, please go ahead.
Okay, you hear me talking now? I just want to make sure. Okay.
Yeah, but please speak
I will of course ask then Maya to also elaborate on this a bit, because this is their project, which is a very good example of how survivors can talk about their experiences. I only had few kind of second thoughts on that. Basically, the first, I think the precondition for survivors to be able to open the topic is the society to give space for people to tackle inconvenient truths. What comes to my mind first is that Bulgaria is one unfortunate example in this respect, because immediately after 1989 there wasn't an agreement in society about how we tackle the issue of the forced labor camps in early socialism. The debate was highly politicized, and it made cleavages instead of agreements in society, which basically didn't allow survivors of those camps to open the topic and feel comfortable and feel safe while talking about it. So I first want to say that there must be an agreement in the wider social milieu that these issues are safe to be discussed. So society should be ready. Second, and very much related to this, is that we need to have psychosocial services offered to survivors of war in order to kind of prepare them to be able to discuss the issue with their children. And it's really a pity that we don't have Aida on this now, because she was the one working with children of survivors, tackling the issue of how this may affect the behavior of children, why some children are more aggressive than others. So before preparing the parents and before making the context kind of ready and willing to welcome these narratives, it will be very difficult to also have these conversations going on between parents and children. And finally, as a therapist now, I would touch upon the issue of language, and I would say that the more we talk, the less we do, which means that the more we talk about certain things, the more ready, the more willing we will be to enter into reconciliation processes. So language and talking about things is what enables us, what prevents us from violent behaviors. And that's what I wanted to say, and I hand over to Maya now.
Maya, would you like to? Maya, we cannot hear you. Are you speaking? Okay, but I can also see there is discussion going on in the chat room. Either you would like to add on how it goes with integration and how this helps to stimulate people to openly talk with their families. So we have one more question in the Q&A. What type of short-term psychosocial activities can we do now with Syrian children and families when we have very little time with them? Kalina, you have least technical difficulties from all of us. Would you like to take this question?
Sure. Can you please repeat the question, or maybe type it again, because I didn't hear the last bit of it.
Yeah. What type of short-term psychosocial activities can we do now with Syrian children and families when we have very little time with them?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you for this question. It's an interesting one. We do have little time for them because we are in a position of a transitionary country. Countries, also Hungary is amongst these. Bulgaria, definitely, they stay for not more than 3-4 months, so it's definitely a short-term activity with them. I can share the experience of my organization, what we are doing with children and families. I personally had one group of children which was on an ongoing, for like 7-8 sessions when children could join and explore one of the following topics: my home, my family, myself, my journey, the transitionary country, and my future. And basically within these groups, they were asked to make a drawing and also discuss these drawings with the other children, so that they can open space for the topic to be discussed with a therapist, in the presence of a therapist, also with other children, but more importantly, in the safe space of a group without their parents being present. Of course, we would take the informed consent of the parents for their children to participate. So this is one type of a group activity which is not very, it is therapeutic, but it's not so much going in depth so that we need so much time, but still we go through several important issues which are these children's preoccupations. The second thing, which is also good to be done, is to engage children in whatever creative activities in order not to allow them to kind of submerge, to dive into timeliness when they don't have anything to do, they don't have school, they don't have their domestic environment and friends and so on and so forth. So that you basically structure their time in short-term activities such as art activities, language courses, you enroll them in school. So basically this is part of the integration process, but it also helps children kind of structure their daily activities and help the families also engage with more important kind of survival related issues such as finding a job for the parents or arranging their journey or whatever, instead of being preoccupied with problems within the family and kind of thinking constantly about their past and their traumas. So these are the few things I can think of now.
Thank you very much, Kalina. Aida and Maya, you still can try and talk if it works, if you want to add something. Not sure if it works, but you can try. Maya, I can see your microphone is on, but we cannot hear you for some reason.
But I can see that Aida wants to add something on this question, and I think it will be very useful because she works with children. Maybe if we allow some time for her to type it.
Yes, sure.
In the meantime, may I say something which was Aida's idea just
Yes, sure.
a couple of minutes ago. The sentence she was sharing with us that children are symptoms and without working with the adult symptoms will never end. I very much agree with this, and I guess that what Aida meant by saying this is that very often children express as the most vulnerable members of the family, they do express the anxieties and the difficulties of the parents through bodily symptoms because children are less verbal and less able to express themselves otherwise. So basically what we have to do is, apart from working with the children, also working with the family in order to secure for the children a safe space, not to have something they need to express. I'm not sure whether this was what Aida had in mind, so please confirm. But I felt this was a very important issue to be discussed.
I can see Aida agrees.
Okay, that's good. And also what she meant by I don't have any other option but to kind of guess what she meant by integration. That is very important when it comes to speaking openly about war experiences. But if I may elaborate on this further, speaking openly means that we don't leave space for imagination and fantasy. So basically, we don't encapsulate experiences in fragments, bits, and pieces, but when we openly share them, that helps people integrate and instead of encapsulate what they've been through. So again, I'm not sure what this is what she meant, but I hope she would give a feedback on that. Yeah, okay.
While Ida is writing, I would like to thank you very much for the topics you suggested. The one on the boys and men involvement, this is a super interesting one. Thank you for suggesting it. We have been thinking about exploring this one in more details, and we will have a set of resources prepared on this topic. I think in December or January. Please keep an eye on this. And yeah, I think it's a great idea to have a separate webinar on that. So we will definitely do that. And for other topics as well, thank you.
And one final remark maybe about the predictive environment. Again, Aida's topic, just a few comments before, when she's talking about the predictive environment, which is crucial when it comes to the trauma symptoms. I guess we can elaborate on this further in an even separate webinar, but since the trauma victim normally is very fragmented and very dissociated from the experience, what helps these victims to structure their experience is the ability to provide them with a predictive environment. This is also something which we have when we talk about small children and babies, and how very important for the babies to attach, to connect to a parent, to an adult who can be predictive and whose behavior can be consistent. So the child can have consistent expectations and consistent responses.
Thank you, Kalina, and thank you, Aida, for your comments. Would you like to add anything else or ask any other questions, or are we good to finalize this webinar now? Please let me know. Kalina, Maya, Aida, is there anything else you would like to add?
I only want to add that I feel very, very much disappointed with the fact that we couldn't hear the third speaker, and that's very sad. And apart from this, I do thank everyone who joined the webinar today, and I hope to hear from you soon.
Yes, thank you very much, Kalina. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Aida. We're sorry, I don't know what happened. I hope we will have another webinar with you in the future. And thank you very much to all participants for joining us. Please keep an eye on other webinars we are organizing. We are giving at least one webinar a month. You can find them all on our childhub.org website. And have a nice day. Thank you. Bye.